Wiradjuri, Yuandu Kate, Baladu Wiradjuri Yina, Diril Milinia. Hello, my name's Kate and I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman, and of course I will start with an acknowledgement of the country in which I'm standing, working and walking today, which is Ngunnawal Ngambri country, land that was and waters that were never ceded. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and I'd really like to acknowledge traditional custodians' waterway management expertise, which not only allowed their people to survive for millennia, but allowed my mob and other mobs to come and visit, play, trade on Ngunnawal Ngambri country. So that's a pretty excellent level of water management skill, I would have thought. And I'd also like to pay acknowledgement to waterways, the waterways themselves. Waterways sustain country, they sustain us individually and collectively, and without waterways, we'd all be in a little bit of trouble. And I'd also like to acknowledge any other Indigenous peoples who may be listening to this presentation. So I'm currently doing a PhD at the Fenner School, and it investigates the role of Indigenous sciences, approaches and methods in ameliorating water quality outcomes in stormwater. I've used Australian and Thai Indigenous sciences, and in practical terms what it means is that essentially I've installed small pieces of wooden infrastructure in a stormwater channel that you may also know as Yowlumna Creek. The original image here is a fish fence constructed by using local wisdom, Pumbanya Tongtin, which is the Thai Indigenous science. This particular construction is generally, as far as I can tell, only found on this particular river in this particular part of Thailand. It's essentially a fish fence that is designed to catch fish in moderate to high flows, and as the water recedes, the fish and other stuff are nominally left floundering there, and you come and you take what you want or what you need. I kind of like this idea for pulling rubbish out of a stormwater creek. So I created what I called a fibbish fence. It's a cross between fish and rubbish. And I was hoping that I could put it in the channel in some way that it could collect large rubbish at low and moderate flows. But I just couldn't work out a way to connect it to the bank that would make it safe and would make it practical. So you'll be pleased to know that the fibbish fence did not make the cut. But I've also, previous to this PhD, done master's research in how modern science, however you want it, like if that's the word you have to use, and Thai local wisdom, Pumbanya Tongtin, view stormwater. And really it was a pretty simple thesis, because at the end of it, what I had to say was Indigenous science in Thailand doesn't have any understanding of the notion of stormwater. And this was interesting, I thought, because klongs or canals are actually pretty familiar waterscapes in this part of the world, you know, large poles, somewhat lined, that allows water to move really quickly from one space to another. But these relatively large pieces of infrastructure were actually used primarily for transport, irrigation and domestic purposes. To use a canal or a klong or any other water source as a waste sink was considered an absolute last purpose historically. But the whole idea of a waste stream that was nominated as waste before the water had actually been used, was just considered entirely unfathomable in Thai local wisdom. Like I had to find many different ways to articulate what I was trying to describe, and my Thai language skills are pretty solid. So it was just conceptually unfamiliar, let alone linguistically unfamiliar. And I think the same can be said for Indigenous water management approaches across what was never this terra nullius. So the notion of classifying overland flow as waste and then to further actively, knowingly pollute it seems for Indigenous sciences a world of weird away. And rightly so. Stormwater, it's an intellectual construct. We need to be quite honest about this. It's an intellectual construct. It enables the externalities of capitalism to continue unabated. So no one pays for what goes down the system. I'm dealing with sediment slugs coming down Yowlumna Creek pretty much every day because of poor construction practices from the CBD in Phillip or the CAD in Phillip. No one's paying for that. The developers get cheaper construction costs and higher profits. Ultimately, I think what happens when we create and maintain and promote this thing called stormwater is we're actually further encouraging the commodification of water by increasing scarcity. By saying overland flow that hits concrete is waste water, is just crazy. Like, this water is deemed untouchable. But we've all seen crazy statistics, which I couldn't be bothered pulling out the real ones for, but we've all seen stuff like the amount of water discharged through Brisbane's stormwater drain could satisfy Brisbane's urban water needs for 12 months. We've all seen these kind of statistics. So we know that there is a scarcity in water being created by constructing something immediately as waste. And I think this idea that by constructing a waste stream up front before it's even dirty, it just reinforces this idea that the so-called water crisis is in fact a management crisis. We don't know how to manage water proper. It's really just that simple. But regardless of the why of a stormwater system, the fact remains that the resultant hydrological and broader environmental problems are quite clear. And this is why people talk about an urban stream syndrome. Essentially, the urban stream syndrome is a suite of changes found in modified creeks across the globe. Granted, the work started in North America, but the urban stream syndrome was first coined in 2005. And in 2020, there are lots of places across the world that not only use this term, but can match their changes in their waterways to this suite of changes in modified creeks. And we have to be fair, there is no more creek modified in this world than a stormwater channel. So what do you get with urban stream syndrome? But you're going to have a flashier hydrograph, you're going to have elevated concentrations of nutrients and contaminants, clearly altered channel morphology, and quite clearly reduced biotic richness. And I can offer a very timely example of the elevated concentrations of nutrients because the fieldwork that I'm doing, and today's day 27, consecutive days since the first day, that first bit of rain, the 80 mils we got a few weekends ago. And I'm still chasing the nitrate tail of that. It's still sitting pretty consistently at 5 milligrams per litres at my two key sites. And background for these two key sites is 1 or 0.5 for the downstream site. And so how did it come to this? How did it come to this? That we as a community, as a society, felt that concreting waterways was the first and best response to large volumes of overland flow. I think it's in large part because underlying the stormwater construct is a specific way of thinking that is not readily found in Indigenous science, could be argued is in fact the anathema to Indigenous science. Broadly and simply speaking, the values underlying the stormwater concept and the way we develop the infrastructure. I've got 4 things I'd like to raise. The first one is, the first way of thinking is this suppression or even extinction of local environmental processes to suit human needs and desires. So I'm going to use channel bank storage as an example of this. Channel bank storage is a fairly important function, and one of the things that it does is it increases the capacity of the channel to store water during events as the stage rises. Some of that water can infiltrate into the channel bank. You'll also get overland flow infiltrating, and you also get rainfall with direct infiltration. When the hydraulic gradient changes and stage starts to fall, then you'll get exfiltration of the water out of that landmass. Now you look at that big picture on that screen. Where can water infiltrate or exfiltrate from the channel into that bank? The theory is it can't, right? The theory is that there's a relatively closed environment and that water will come in and go out in relatively consistent or predictable volumes. So you look at that little photo down the left-hand side, the little nice green thing around the hole in the channel bank storage. So that is a channel bank storage site in Thailand. This photo was taken in wet season, but it is actually a dry season drinking site. So you can see through the filtration processes that water is actually really delicious to drink in dry season, and a really critical supply because in dry season in Thailand, it is extremely dry. And the other picture, the little wooden thing on the concrete bank, it's my attempt to replicate channel bank storage in channels that have had these functions extinguished. And you know, I fully acknowledge that this little space here in no way makes up for something like this, but it's a start. I think another way of thinking that contributes to this stormwater construct is that infrastructure is big and it's permanent. And why? I don't understand this. These things aren't intrinsically robust or enduring. And in fact, in a paper that I'll give you a reference for at the end, the authors quote another author as describing infrastructure as temporary lines across active environments that erode, rust and fracture. So you think how big the stormwater system is, like it's a city. And if you've got a big city, you've got a really big system. And if you've got a small city, you've got a really small city, but essentially they cross the whole city. And even the wetlands and the rain gardens that are being retrofit, particularly in the ACT, they're quite big. And how many infrastructure managers complain about having to maintain the entire city's stormwater system? And now they're starting to complain about having to manage the green infrastructure that's associated with the stormwater systems these days. So you look at this picture here and you can see that this part of the Yarralumla Channel gives this really quite clear sense of permanence, right? You've got bridges and roads are going over it. You can see that it's almost as big as that first part of Mawson Southland shopping area. Like, it looks really solid. But then when you look at it a bit more closely, you can see that in spite of what I said earlier about heavy armouring of channel bank storage is still trying to exist, it's still trying to function. This creek, this reach of this creek is clearly gaining, and it's coming through this water, is exfiltrating from the landmass underneath, what, 10 centimetres of concrete or concrete equivalent? So how can we think that this infrastructure is permanent when we've got this amount of water coming back into the system in what's supposed to be an armoured system? When you look at these areas, see how damaged this infrastructure is. You know how little maintenance is done on these things. Why would we think that they're going to be permanent when we're not going to even look after them? Convenience and speed is a really critical part. It's argued as a really critical part of why these large, fast infrastructures are so obdurate in the landscape. They're built quickly, stormwater channels, with the aim of moving water quickly. And what it does is these systems offer convenience to human beings, but not much else. But I think it's a superficial convenience. If you think just about urban stream syndrome, what we gain in the short term, we lose significantly in the long term. One other consequence of this way of thinking, these large, quick, fast infrastructures, is they become highly centralised systems, and that force people into systems of uneven power and resource distribution. And this uneven distribution of power and resources occurs both during the construction phases and the destruction phases, whether the destruction is conscious or just a question of poor maintenance budgets. It also happens during the operational life of the infrastructure. You might think that a stormwater channel is not a site of power or resource contestation, but they really are. And you think about the economic modelling that's now happening around wetlands and the contribution they pay to developers and land values. That's a clear case of an inequitable distribution of resources and power. Another important aspect of the speed and convenience of contemporary infrastructure is that there's really any planning about how to manage the infrastructure's lifestyle or its ultimate demise. And I reckon this is so clearly the case in Canberra in our stormwater systems. You don't need to walk very far up any one of our concrete channels to see that they are not well maintained. They are not well managed. And so, as Barlow and Drew note, fast infrastructure are crisis-ridden because they offer quick and temporary solutions to problems that have their origins in colonial logics of linear time, endless growth, and human exceptionalism. This is my final thought about one of the ways of thinking that really promotes this stormwater construct, and the notion that this job, urban water management, stormwater management, is a job only for experts, for technocrats and bureaucrats, engineers. And again, I ask why. With this emphasis on technocratic expertise, it just becomes a vicious cycle. Only certain types of knowledge are considered valid, certain practices appropriate or inappropriate. Anything outside of the valid and appropriate categories is just dismissed. And then there's the danger of the herd mentality that can develop. Old ideas and values persist, even in the face of great change when you're working with a herd mentality. Things outside irrigation, household domestic, the sectoral division of water, those things aren't acknowledged, counted or managed for by institutional water managers. If it's not supply, if it's not waste, if it doesn't have an economic benefit, don't want to know about it. Yet some of the most important uses of water for individuals are not these uses. It's the spiritual, social and cultural uses of water. So sitting by the beach, that kind of stuff. It bothers me that the expertise, interest and enthusiasm of the layperson is considered irrelevant and dismissed. I don't understand why power and control can't be shared. So these things and others lead me to argue that there is a definite need to reconsider the role of overland flow. Overland flow is okay, people. It's not a bad thing. It is not our enemy. But the reality of this particular intellectual construct is that the far-reaching negative social, environmental, physical consequences, I just think they're really much more than what we get in terms of protecting life and property when you consider that You can protect property by decent council regulations. You don't actually need to have a stormwater channel. You can just get people to build appropriately in appropriate places with appropriate materials. So I think it's well beyond time to reconsider overland flow, to remember, acknowledge and cherish how useful and valuable it actually really is. At a very, very simple level, global food production relies on it. And yet, armouring waterways to rapidly transport pollutions ultimately being dumped downstream, it's not a universal idea. It's a choice that we've made in a socio-political way for a variety of purposes that I think most people aren't fully aware of. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately a choice. And I believe that Indigenous sciences offer other choices in how overland flow can be valued and managed. And this is where we get to start thinking about how we can challenge the stormwater construct. And I think the first step is really, really easy. Just slow down. And I'm not talking about the flow, I'm talking about our expectations as individuals, as communities, as societies. And I'm going to use the Basin Priority Project, or now also known as the Healthy Waterways Project, as an example of how going slow can produce better outcomes. That Basin Priority Project started in 2014 and nominally finished at the end of last financial year, 2019-2020 financial year. 6 catchments in less than 6 years. I think more than 50, probably closer to 100, can't remember now. Interventions and sites and treatment trains were identified in the preliminary process. In a matter of months, these were culled, and now we have approximately 20 pieces of infrastructure actually in channels across catchments in this city. Now, I'm sure some people go back, yes, fabulous engineering effort. But let's just think about all the things that we didn't really have time for in this 4-year project. Did we really stop to think if the goals were appropriate? Is managing nitrates, phosphates and turbidity really all that is required to get healthy waterways? Were the sites appropriate? Can you really work this out by having a bit of a scan on Google Earth and maybe one field trip? Was the infrastructure for that site or sites, were they appropriate? Did they really fit in with how the system works? Did you know enough about the system, all 6 of them, to be able to select appropriate infrastructure, to design that infrastructure appropriate for the site in which it was? Or did you just pull a sort of a template out of a program and fiddle around the edges for the Google Earth map that you were working on? Was the build actually done right? If you've just whacked 20 pieces of infrastructure in about 18 months across 6 catchments, how do you know the quality of the work that's being done? How do you develop the operational and maintenance expertise required? This is a part of the reason why there was a 2-year handover period for this infrastructure. Roads did not want to be responsible for infrastructure that they did not understand. They didn't want to take over a bunch of infrastructure where the plants were going to die, and yet it's the plants that do the work. There was not time to develop the operational and maintenance expertise. It's being done on the fly, and that's going to have long-term implications for the way this infrastructure works. If we had just slowed right down, maybe worked on one catchment over an extended period of time, I'm fairly confident the results would have been different and quite possibly better. The second challenge is to think from a country perspective. That going slow is an Indigenous science thing. This is an Australian Indigenous science thing. Thinking about country, thinking about every being, everything, and how we are all fundamentally and intimately interconnected. And I can do this really simply. I can demonstrate this really simply with this channel bank storage example again. So you just think about that site, that image that I showed you back there. In that channel bank storage site, water goes in, water goes out. That water is connected to the sky, it is connected to the land, it is connected to the deep earth, it is connected to the surface water. There are animals and plants that exist on and within both the water mass and the land mass that rely on that exchange process. We rely on that exchange process. We rely on the plants and the animals in that particular landmass to produce our air, clean, to help us with food, pollination. One tiny little bit of channel bank storage site connects everything. That's country. We are all connected all the time. We cannot function without each other. More simply, as an Indigenous colleague once said to a friend of mine, There are no rights in a dead river. The other challenge, I think, is to include non-experts. We should be aspiring for much more than just trying to inveigle people into less than satisfactory consultation processes. Citizen science is a fabulous start. I'm a long-time water watcher, swear by it, love it, always trying to get people engaged. But there's more things that people can do. Not everyone wants to go out once a month and get their hands wet and walk along the side of a creek, but they might want to pick rubbish out occasionally, or help design a small piece of infrastructure, or help maintain that small piece of infrastructure. There's a whole bunch of things that people can do, particularly at a local scale. My community group, I got a little community group that helps me out in my thesis, and these guys are part of it. And you can see how they're helping me build the first run of channel bank storage sites there. They helped me design that, they helped me build that. They brought along a bucket load of tools and enthusiasm and problem-solving expertise that I so appreciated, like really made a fundamental difference to how I felt about the designs, how I felt about it working, and how I felt about it sitting in that landscape, because I knew locals there were happy with it. The other thing that was really cool about including non-experts, so it wasn't just an advantage for me, it was an advantage for them. They had an opportunity to demonstrate their understanding of environmental processes and the importance of water in the landscape and the waterscape, and they really did have quite a good idea what was going on. I'd barely had finished explaining channel bank storage, and they were both running away with ideas about how to speed up this infill process and what plants would be best to seed with. Including non-experts is also like just fiscally pragmatic. If the budget for stormwater channel maintenance is approximately $0 a year, then why not ask your community to come in and give you a hand? It taps into the desire of those on the ground to be actively engaged in waterway management. And it also reflects Indigenous science, where you've got the dude with the knowledge, like the knowledge holder, the person who's ultimately responsible for that, in this case, managing waterways. But they can't do what they need to do without mob. And mob comes in, pitches in under the guidance and tutelage of your person responsible for that. You start to identify who's got skills so you can train up the next generations of leader, the next generation of custodians. The final challenge of the ones that I want to talk about today is to accept impermanence. Give up this notion of dominance, that things must be there forever, that we have control, that we can flood-proof. No, we can't, people. Small scale, locally appropriate and locally designed infrastructure will work with this notion of impermanence. It will work with water needs, or with the way water functions. If you add this together with appropriate land planning regulations that I mentioned earlier, you can do so much more to challenge form and function of stormwater channels. And working small, working locally, but still cognizant of what's happening upstream and downstream, because that's the way Indigenous science works. You know there are other mobs and that they have rights and responsibilities as well as you. Then working locally is actually really quite sensible. If something breaks, because things always do, you can go and fix it really quick, really easily. You don't have to wait for a work order to be processed and go through the various levels of approvals and then find out if there's the money in the budget. And then you find out you've got all this, and then you've got to filter back down to the work team. Who's going to go? When are they going to go? How are you going to schedule it? Do they have all the tools? Impermanence is a much nicer approach. It allows more fluidity, more flexibility. This is my first treatment train. You're coming up, this is the island of sediment that's been built up behind this temporary and impermanent leaky weir. You're following it down now to the second leaky weir. You can see very small changes in form, but I hope you can see that there's probably a very large change in the function of the channel. Those little leaky weirs can get washed away, and I can just come back and put them in, or a person in the community can just come back and put them in. So impermanence is our friend. By having these impermanent features in this permanent, quasi-permanent structure, it's not actually detracting from the known function, the standard function of a stormwater channel. It does allow some water to be treated as it goes further downstream. It keeps sediment upstream until it's washed down in a large wash. It breaks up the monoculture. I've seen all sorts of little lizards and bugs and butterflies and stuff going on the larger islands. It has some values other than just water quality improvements. So these four things that I've just raised, I think, can be nicely summarised in the Wiradjuri word Impermanence. Impermanence is really essentially a lifestyle. It's how we like to live. It's how we like to think that we live, or certainly did live historically. The dictionary definition is terribly bland. It's terribly bland. To do something slowly, to respect, to be gentle, to be polite, to honour. Gentle, polite and honourable, respectful to everything, not just to other human beings, but to the waterways that sustain us. And this notion of Yinjamarra includes the idea that no one has all the knowledge. If you have someone who is a custodian for a particular thing, there is someone else, often in another mob, so not in Wiradjuri, but maybe Millaroy or someone next door, who has a similar function for just in case. So should you lose that lineage of people who are responsible for waterway management in a certain part of a certain country, in traditional times before colonialisation came and smashed it to bits, there would have been someone else in another community who had those similar responsibilities, so you could step in and stuff could go on. No one has all the knowledge. Life and time is not linear. This is what people think when they put in a stormwater chain. We'll put it in, it will run in a straight line, the water will run in a straight line, and it will work in a straight line through time. The Indigenous communities and the Indigenous knowledge systems that I am familiar with, time is so far from linear, it blows your mind. Doctor Who's time is a wibbly wobbly thing is the closest thing I can come to articulating to non-Indigenous people. But I think it's also encapsulating that notion, the more things change, the more they stay the same. To me, is a way of saying time is not linear. It's actually a bit circular or spirally or something. And a really important one, which I think a lot of things in Western society could value, could really learn, could really get some good traction from is no ego. Let's be humble, people. This planet is not here for you and me. This planet is just here, and everything on this planet has as much right to the waterways as we do. I'd just like to finish off with a little bit of Wiradjuri because I need to practice. Yinjamara bala, mugu manawa yangu. Yinjamara is in the song of running water. I just think that's a beautiful saying. Threw it in because wouldn't it be nice if we didn't look at our waterways as a source of destruction and terror and threat? If we can remember that they are beautiful, relaxing, social sites. I make no secret about my desire to see every single piece of concrete in stormwater systems ripped up. I also make no secret of my pragmatic, if reluctant, acceptance that this is not going to happen in my lifetime. What might happen in my lifetime is a profound shift in modern science's thinking about stormwater to the point that it actually rejects the stormwater construct, and that we can get a gradual decline in the spatial extent of conventional stormwater systems and the associated volume of concrete. Rather than a concrete monoculture with water running essentially in a straight line, there could be pools and riffles, for example, slowing water to create the conditions for both more environmental processes to occur and for greater biodiversity to exist. If the current stormwater channel maintenance regime is maintained, that is, nothing is done, then bit by bit, if you put in small infrastructure, those reaches could be renaturalised just by letting the concrete do what it does, decay, and then slowly over time, you could end up with a fully renaturalised channel that doesn't cost us a fortune because you haven't ripped it all up at once and renaturalised. You do it bit by bit, using a slow and steady approach. But before we get to that, the first thing we need to do is challenge quite strongly the stormwater construct. Mandangu, thank you.